A Lost Legacy, Awakening. Read by the author, C.E. Dimond. Chapter 1. The dark sky hung over the coast like a heavy curtain, barely visible through the thick of the trees. I was still, frozen in time as my eyes turned to take in the scene. As far as I could see, the forest was the only shelter for miles. In the darkness, the only thing visible was the soft glow of the moon fighting against the clouds. Where was I? Shifting my attention, I caught a glimmer of light in the distance. Narrowing my eyes, I focused my gaze before making my way towards it. It took a moment before I discerned that the glimmer was a reflection. In the distance, the faint light of the moon was reflecting off a woman's silvery blonde hair. She was running. I glanced around frantically, but it was unclear what she was running from. Taking a calming breath, I moved closer, watching as she shifted something in her arms. Through the mess of fabric, only the small fist of an infant was visible. The rest of the child wrapped tight and hidden beneath her coat. I followed. My feet took me after her, further into the darkness. Her heartbeat was racing. I could hear it, feel it. On the surface, she appeared calm. The way she weaved between the trees appeared effortless, determined until she finally came to an abrupt stop. She had reached the edge of the tree line, a clearing which looked out over the endless ocean view. I stopped, just near the edge of the forest, covering myself beneath the trees as I watched from the distance. I could hear the waters below crashing roughly against the rocks. The spray of the salty mist was cool against my skin. I watched as the woman I'd followed turned to a man who was now standing next to her. I hadn't noticed him until then, and even now that I was aware of his presence, there wasn't much to see. His hood was pulled up, leaving his face shrouded in darkness. Still, I continued to watch in silence as the woman handed the wrapped child to him. She shifted guardianship of the infant from one to the other. She stepped back then, creating space between them. It was clear that there was nowhere for her to run. The sounds of footsteps were closing in. With each second, I could hear the pounding of the hard ground growing closer and closer. Someone knew she was out there. "You need to get her out of here." The woman moved forward again, resting her hand on the child's head. Her blue eyes stared with concern. The man nodded, shifting the child in his own arms. He pulled his own coat around to cover the infant from the elements. The footsteps grew louder as I felt the ground beneath me begin to shake. I wanted to say something, to let them know how close they were, but despite my best efforts, nothing came out. I had no voice, no sound. "Go," I heard her plead, a desperation in her voice that I hadn't heard before. "Now, they don't know you're here. He doesn't want you," she added. Despite her pleas, the man was hesitant to leave. "Please," she begged. I could feel my throat tightening as I kept my gaze on the man. He was determined to defy her. He parted his lips to say something, but stopped, then nodded in agreement. He closed the space between them and embraced her, his arm wrapped firmly around her, holding her against him. He leaned down and whispered something into her ear. But as I strained to listen, his words were lost in the wind. He held her for a moment longer, before stepping back, breaking their contact. He turned and disappeared back into the trees. Just as quickly as the woman had arrived there, he was gone. He moved right past me, brushing past, oblivious to my presence. I turned and followed after him. He was running as fast as his legs could carry him, and mine were failing to match his pace. He glanced back only once, and it was then that I saw a faint glint of emerald eyes. Following his gaze, I looked over my shoulder, just in time to see a bright white flash. The distant sounds of a woman's scream echoed around us. I sat up with a start. My heart raced wildly as my eyes took in my surroundings. After a moment of panic, calm settled over me as I discovered I was in my room. It had only been a dream. A horrific, confusing, and altogether terrifying dream. My heart was still racing, pounding fiercely against my chest. I felt a cold sweat beading on the back of my neck. It took a few seconds before I figured out that I was still holding my breath. Letting out a sigh of relief, I turned my eyes to the clock by my bed. A groan escaped my lips as I noticed the time. 3 a.m. Running a hand down my face, I took a second to compose myself. Taking in slow, careful breaths, I tried to calm my heart rate. Sliding my hand back up across my face, I ran it through the long strands of my blonde hair, pulling them back off my neck. As I turned to lie back down, a shadow moved past my window, and I froze. My breath had caught in my chest once more as I debated my next move. Standing up, I moved with careful precision towards the window. Peering through the sheer, white curtain, I found nothing but the darkened street below. The quiet neighborhood was illuminated by the singular lamppost at the intersection. Its light stretched only so far, but as I waited, nothing stirred. Of course there was nothing there. My bedroom was on the second story. Nervous, I placed the tips of my fingernails between my teeth. This sort of paranoia was one of the first signs of insanity. Finally, I let my breath out. I stared at the streets for a moment longer, just to be certain. When I was convinced the coast was clear, I shook my head and turned back to bed. It was clear I needed rest. Between the hallucinations and the dream, my chance of getting a decent night's sleep was dwindling. Lying back down, I gazed at the ceiling for a moment before I squeezed my eyes shut. School started back tomorrow, the first day of junior year, which just meant one more year of being a little bit lower on the food chain. I turned my head to peek through the slit lids at the time. I blinked in confusion as the clock still read 3 a.m. Reaching my hand over, I hit it only to see that the digital reading changed. 3:01. Yep, it was definitely broken. With a defeated sigh, I closed my eyes again, trying to let the dream escape my mind as I drifted back to sleep. The alarm rang out, startling me from my otherwise peaceful sleep. Nothing broken about that, I muttered, as I pulled an extra pillow over my ears to block out the sound. The first day was always the hardest, and I was still tired from the interrupted sleep. With a groan of protest, I threw the pillow at the clock. That didn't accomplish anything, other than the sound of something crashing onto the floor. Managing to push myself up, I leaned over and turned the alarm off before stifling a yawn. My blue eyes squinted, gradually adjusting to the bright sun pouring through my windows. It took a few seconds before I could see my surroundings. Standing up, I felt my foot catch on something before I took a stumble straight to the ground. "Ow," I muttered with a sigh, just lying there, face down on the rug. It wasn't unusual for me, tripping over my own mess of clothes. I lay there in silence before I wondered if I could just forget about school. "Finn, darling, stop dawdling. You'll be late for school." Like clockwork, I heard my mother's voice. So much for staying home. I swear, sometimes she was psychic. Rolling onto my back, I turned my attention to my closet. My uniform skirts were hanging all neat in an untouched row. At least there was one upside. I didn't have to worry about what I was going to wear today. As I drew my head back to stare at the ceiling, something caught my attention. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw an unfamiliar flash of light radiate through the window. I sat up so fast a rush of dizziness flew to my head. The room was spinning before my eyes. I waited until the sensation passed before I turned to look closer at the window. Kicking the tangled sheets and clothes from around my feet, I stood and hurried over to the glass. Hanging from the windowsill, just outside my window, was a piece of blue glass, shaped in the form of a crescent moon. My body went cold, the familiar tingle of anxiety surging through my fingers, the numbness settling in. It wasn't mine. In an instant, my mind wandered back to the passing shadow. Maybe my hallucination hadn't been a hallucination after all. I opened the window gently and reached out for the dangling moon. Closing my hand around it, I unhooked it from the ledge and swiftly pulled it aside. I slammed my window shut and opened my hand to get a closer look. "Finn, now!" I jumped as my mother's voice echoed through the house, shaking me from my thoughts. I hesitated before placing it down on my desk. "I can investigate later." "Coming, I'm coming," I said, turning away from the window. I stopped at my door before turning back to slide the lock across the window frame. Paranoid or not, I didn't want to take any chances. Stepping back, I turned, grabbing my uniform from the closet, and hurried to get ready for the day. The bus ride to school was agonizing. I endured it because I knew it was only a short time until I could get my license. Once I had my own car, I could forget about the bus altogether. It felt like days passed as my eyes focused on the world passing by. Then the bus finally came to an abrupt stop in front of Greyfell. I stayed back as everyone made a mad dash for the front doors. There was no need to get trampled on the first day. As I eventually stepped off the bus, I took a moment to smooth out my skirt before taking the time to look around. I laughed softly as I noticed that everyone else's uniforms seemed to be in perfect condition. It was the first day illusion. In a matter of hours, we'd all look like a disheveled mess, shirts untucked, knee-highs falling. It was inevitable. "Finn!" A familiar voice rang out across the courtyard, but failed to draw my attention. I stood staring at the school, taking in the looming doom that was junior year. I didn't even flinch at the sound of his voice. "Hey, princess, I'm talking to you." That caught my attention. Tearing my eyes away from the building, they soon settled upon the approaching male, Tyler Adler. "Hey, Ty," I said with a grin. Tyler Adler and I had been friends for as long as I could remember, at least since nursery school, when he tried to steal my Lego block. Most times, I could never figure out why he'd stuck around. He was Mr. Popular now, captain of the soccer team, student council rep. His golden locks and sparkling green eyes made him the target of every other girl in school. Yet, he still hung around with me, the mediocre student and the extracurricular avoider. It was safe to say our long-standing friendship meant a lot to him, which admittedly made me happy. Most days, Tyler's optimism made waking up in the morning worth it. In a matter of seconds, he'd scoop me up in a hug, spinning me off the ground before finally setting me back down. I stumbled, not quite steady on my feet. Seriously, you'd think I hadn't seen you in months. In reality, we'd had a movie night the day before. In fact, we'd hung out almost every night that summer. "It's the first day of school, I'm pumped," he said with a laugh. I stared at him in disbelief. I knew the expression on my face portrayed my disgust at the idea of being excited about school. "You are the only person I know who would ever say that," I accused him with a smile. "I'm the only person you know, period," he joked, which was met with my fist in his shoulder. Much to my dismay, he didn't even flinch, and I sighed in defeat. I, on the other hand, am wallowing in the depression that summer's over. I let my eyes scan the hordes of students piling off the bus and out of their fancy cars. Greyfell Academy was home to the students of the wealthiest people in town. That didn't make it much different than any other school, in my opinion. Granted, I didn't know the difference. I'd been lucky enough to be born as one of those children. My dad, William Adams, had died when I was 3. Despite this fact, he had ensured the family legacy didn't die with him. My mom had managed to keep the family business afloat and the Adams money rolling in. "Ah, come on, 2 more years, kid, then we'll blow this town. You and me against the world," he said, putting his arm around my shoulder and leading me towards the school. 2 more years, I repeated with slow assurance. Only 2 more years. The morning dragged on, and by the time lunch rolled around, I found I was already sick of being in school. Everywhere I turned, there were students ranting about something that felt meaningless, repetitive. The sports teams, homecoming, the head girl's new haircut. I often wondered if school ever changed, or was it the same stupid cycle, repeating itself generation after generation? The best years of my life? It felt unimaginable. Sitting through math was always the most painful experience of all. I had never quite figured out how quadratic equations were going to help me get through life. My teacher seemed to find them of the utmost importance. He didn't seem to care how little I actually understood. Math and science were not my thing. I'd always excelled in English, languages, random pop trivia facts. Okay, that wasn't an actual subject, but if it had been, I would have killed that class so hard. Instead, I suffered through pre-calculus, physics, chemistry, and biology, just to please my mother. I accepted that she had a point about keeping my options open, but that didn't mean I had to like it. Besides, I doubted that my biological understanding of a frog's anatomy would be relevant in my life. I sat in class, tapping my pencil on the desk to pass the time. My eyes glanced at the clock above the door, and I sighed. There were still 10 more minutes until lunch. I narrowed my eyes dangerously at the clock. I was dying of boredom. Staring at the time passing was just as fascinating as class. I jumped as the bell rang through the school and watched as people flew from their desks. I looked around at the others. I saw the teacher staring at his watch in confusion. Meanwhile, the students were filing out into the halls. Confused, I glanced back at the clock. 12:30. Had I actually spaced out for a full 10 minutes? Grabbing my books, I hurried out into the hall before anyone could tell me it was a mistake. I shuffled through the hallway and turned the corner to my locker. Balancing the books in my arm, I reached for the lock, trying the combination. I'd had the same lock for 5 years. I had it down to basic muscle memory. A frown settled on my lips as the first 3 tries were unsuccessful. Ugh, come on, I muttered, trying it again. Don't quit on me now. Having to get another lock would just throw off the whole system. There was no way I could memorize another combination quick enough. I thought about the embarrassment of having to write it down. Imagine having to pull out the combo for the first month and a half of school just to get my books. No, thank you. Can I ask what you're doing, breaking into my locker? The voice made me jump. I whipped around, my eyes lifted to find a boy next to me. He had a serious, rather intimidating look on his face. His emerald green eyes stared at me, waiting for an explanation. My words were caught in my throat as I stared in return. My eyes only widened. I had no doubt that I appeared like a deer caught in headlights, appearing guiltier than I actually was. He didn't look familiar to me. I couldn't help but focus on that. In Port Moyle, almost everyone was familiar. His raven hair contrasted against the serious lack of tan he was sporting. His look led me to believe he was definitely not from California. Hello? He added, a hint of impatience to his tone. I realized now that I'd been staring at him without even uttering a simple response. Sorry, I mumbled. I leaned against the lockers to support my weight, fighting the blush that was forming on my cheeks. Do you mind? He asked and nodded to the locker. And I stumbled back, allowing him to access it. Sorry, I mumbled again, and watched as he opened it with ease. My eyes turned to the one next to it. Yes, that was my locker. Fighting the blush seemed to no longer be an option as I felt the familiar burn of embarrassment flush my face. My eyes turned back to him and watched as he changed the books in his bag, and I couldn't help but wonder who he was. Do you stare at everybody like that, or am I just lucky? He asked, turning his eyes to me. Amen, Abbott, he said, offering his hand in return. Finn, I said, taking his hand. I know, he said, lifting my hand to show me the bracelet that held my name engraved across the surface. Right, I said with a nervous laugh, and he dropped my hand. As I turned, I opened my own locker and began switching my books. So where are you from? I asked, turning back, and I blinked, surprised to find he was already gone. I turned to check the other direction. I found myself alone in the now empty hallway, and the question from my lips lingering in the air.